Welcome to the second series of the stories behind the songs with Dave Kittle. Back in 1979, Dave began a radio career at CHEZ 106 in Ottawa, which spanned 17 years. He was one of the on-air voices that I grew up listening to, and he introduced me to new music that literally changed my life. His knowledge and passion for music are inspiring, to say the least. And in this 12-part podcast, Dave talks about 8 of his favorite songs and the history of how those songs came to be. So pull up a chair and join us for the stories behind the songs.
She just started coming up with the boom, 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 boom. And that's the driving force of that song. One of the most recognizable bass lines
ever
in history. And that was the great Carol Kay that played on that. She was another member of that. But Glenn Campbell, that's where he got his start as a guitar player with
a phenomenal guitar player,
fabulous guitar player. Played on dozens of hits back in the day. Never credited for them. Leon Russell, that's where he got his start. Tommy Tedesco, who was a fabulously talented guitar player and worked as a session musician all of his career. Never really got much recognition, but he played on all kinds of stuff. But you listen to those, especially those great Beach Boys songs and the great arrangements and
that's
all
incredible.
those musicians.
See, I never would have known. I never would have guessed for a second that it wasn't anyone but the Beach Boys. That's crazy.
No, it was all, Hal Blaine, the great drummer, played with the Tijuana Brass. And, you know, the Tijuana Brass were so popular back in the day. You know, the mid-'60s, they rivaled the Beatles for album sales. They were one of the most biggest selling acts of the day. And the Tijuana Brass basically was Herb Alpert on trumpet. He would double and triple track record his trumpet. And the Wrecking Crew. Hal Blaine on drums and Joe Osborne or Carol Kay on bass, all these guys. And the Tijuana Brass, that's what the Tijuana Brass was Herb Alpert and a bunch of studio musicians. And then when they played on TV or something or went out on the road, he would assemble a band around him. But in the studio, that's who all those guys were. You
know, my wife and I used to watch American Idol all the time. Okay, so since its inception, and we even watched Canadian Idol. Then when it stopped, returned to American. And after a while, they stopped using recorded music for the artists. They actually started assembling live bands on stage for the contestants to sing to. And the more and more you got into the show, the more I realized how you had these phenomenal musicians, and maybe once or twice they'd introduce the bass player or someone, but you had all these other musicians that were getting absolutely no mention. And it occurred to me that Idol and a lot of these, shows, right? Talent shows are only based on the vocalist. They're based on a star. And the music almost seems to be a secondary thing, and I started to get so annoyed with that. I gave up on it, and I don't watch any vocal shows anymore. My wife just found a new one called The Masked Singer.
Oh yeah,
and I don't care. Like I'm done with There was a show. What was it? It was a show about bands, and it wasn't about just the vocalist. Rockstar.
Oh, yes.
Remember that?
Yes, I do.
And where the actual band was looking for whatever, but you still had the band. Like the band was up front.
Wasn't that In Excess?
In Excess was one year, and then
because they had a Canadian that won the vocal thing. I forget what the guy's name was, but it was a Canadian that ended up winning it and went out on the road with them, but it didn't go very far. And, I mean, their career was pretty well done by that point. I mean, Michael Hutchence was he was the focal point and the driving force behind that band. And once he committed suicide, their career was kind of over. Yeah. But no, I agree with you, Norm. I've never been a big fan of any of those. I call them glorified karaoke contests. Okay. I've never been a big fan of any of those shows. And I think the proof in the pudding is the fact that. Has there ever been a big star that has evolved out of any of those shows?
There have been.
Not very many, though.
No, but there's a handful, and
not very many.
But even the fact that there are a handful, to me, doesn't take away from the fact that again the focus is on the one individual.
That's right.
How do we make this person? How do we market this person? But you've got all these fantastic musicians who like the Wrecking Crew are getting nothing. And you know the credits at the end of the show, even if they're listed, they zip by so quickly.
By so
you don't know what the hell.
Exactly.
Even if you pause it, it's so blurry because it's going 100 miles an hour. It's really sad.
Well, and I've always had a soft spot for session guys, session players, the guys that don't get any recognition. They're so talented and so versatile, and they are just they can do everything. They can do anything. Some of them, a few of them, have evolved into being stars, like Glenn Campbell and Leon Russell and a few others. Excuse me, but not very many. Most of them prefer to just to sort of live in the shadows, do their work, and they can walk down the street.
That's right.
They get very well paid. They make a very, very good living, and they can walk down the street at the end of the day and nobody knows who they are. And for some people, that's very appealing.
Yeah, that's why I actually always like voice work. As opposed to on-camera stuff, because you can go in the studio and do whatever you want and just go to Walmart later and although it would be nice to be recognized once. But the band Klaatu, as a quick aside, they were from Buttonville, Ontario.
That's right, Canadian band.
There was John Woloshuk, D. Long, and Terry Draper. Okay, these three guys, and they were session musicians who worked out of the studio in Buttonville and came up with this idea. They wanted to get together. They arranged with the studio that on weekends they could come in and record their own stuff. And so they did that and put out their first album, 347 EST, which incidentally was the time that in the day the Earth stood still. It was 347 EST when the ship landed on Earth and everything shut off.
I did not know that.
That's when all the power went off. That's where they got the name from.
Okay. Because the Klaatu was the character from that movie, right?
Klaatu was
the robot, right?
No. Gort was the robot. It was what's his face? Claude Rene. What's his name?
I know who you mean.
Michael Rene.
Michael Rene. That's it. Yes.
Was Klaatu.
Okay.
So 347 is when
I always thought Klaatu was that silver thing.
No, that's Gort.
Okay.
Gort. So 347 is when all the power shut off, everything stood still. Fantastic movie, by the way. The original, the one with Keanu Reeves.
Yeah,
I'm not going to bother watching
the remake was there.
So they apparently they put that album out after 3 years of working only on the weekends. That's when they released that album. And then, of course, some DJ in upper state New York said, "Oh my God, this guy sounds like it could be the Beatles."
Sounds like the Beatles, yes.
And which was great press.
Very good publicity.
But they never said it.
Very good publicity. And then they had Calling Occupants.
Yes.
Which was covered by the Carpenters.
I don't even want to know that exists.
And then that great song of theirs called Sub Rosa Subway. Sub Rosa Subway. That was their
now the song.
That's the one that really sounded like the Beatles.
It did.
Sub Rosa Subway.
Even more than that, there's a song called California Jam, which is the first song of the second side of that album, where John Woloshuk screams out California, and that sounded so much like McCartney. That was the deal that did it. That's what that put the nail in the coffin right there.
But I remember that quite well. The publicity they got from that. And let's face it. I mean, if it wouldn't have been for that band Klaatu would have disappeared without a trace, probably. But they had a run there of a couple of years.
They did.
Well, that Calling Occupants was a major hit for them.
Oh, it was.
I believe Sub Rosa Subway was a pretty big hit for them as well.
That was the big one. Yeah. Anyway, now I've completely taken this is its
own
own episode.
That was interesting. I like that. But you're right about session guys.
Yeah.
They never ever got the recognition that they deserve. And fortunately, as the 60s went on, later on in the decade, they started doing it in the late 60s. They started publishing album credits as to who actually played on the song.
Right.
Which was very nice.
Yeah.
It was very good.
And about time.
Exactly.
You've been listening to The Stories Behind the Songs with Dave Kittle. Join us again for the next part in this series. Brought to you by Sunholes Music. Download the latest album now at sunholes.com.